So tonight's a little bit different. We're doing a global outreach night. We're going to talk about global outreach around the world that we're doing later in the summer. We have a special guest. She's part of the global outreach team. She is on the student Christian leadership major, and she's her senior year here. Please welcome Kaitlin Riffel. So for those of you who don't know who Kaitlin is, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Kaitlin. Nice to meet you guys. I'm a Christian leadership major here, a senior. Woohoo! And I am on the campus ministries team for global outreach. You guys might have seen me up here a few other times in the past few weeks talking about that. So, yeah.
All right. So I've heard you gone on a couple of global outreach trips before. How many have you gone on?
I have gone on 9 global outreach trips, 9 times international. So, loved that. That's been amazing.
Would you like to talk about a few of them? What are the roles they've had in your life?
Global outreach, if you guys know me or have ever in your life had a conversation with me, you probably know that I love global outreach. It's something that I am so passionate about. It's something that I talk about in every single conversation that I can. And I would say the impact that it's personally had on me is one that I cannot even put into words, because I've seen Jesus literally show up on international mission trips. I've seen him move in big ways, and I think that's really when my faith came to life, was when I was out of my comfort zone, doing crazy things in other countries. Jesus was there. And so global outreach has had a huge, huge impact on me, for sure.
So what's the best trip you've been on, and why?
Okay, so for those of you that were at the Global Outreach Info Night, you have already heard the story, and I'm sorry. I would say, I have 2 answers for this. The first one is, the first global outreach trip I ever went on was to El Salvador, and that was in 2014, I believe. And that trip was probably the most overall just impactful. It was my first time ever out of the country, seeing poverty for the first time, and seeing kids my own age who didn't have a house or didn't have food that night. I know that sounds like simple things we talk about, but actually seeing it in real life, in real time, is a completely different experience. So that in itself was extremely impactful, but I think that's how it is usually when we leave the country for the first time. The second example, I would say, was a time that I was able to go down to Costa Rica, and it was a super spontaneous trip, super out of the blue. We heard from a few pastors down in Costa Rica that they needed people to bring down water filters. And the reason for that was because it was during the time when all the hurricanes were hitting all sorts of places around the world, and one had hit Costa Rica really badly. And so these pastors reached out to me and my dad, and they were like, "We need water filters. Can you come down in a couple days?" And we were like, "Sure, of course. Well, why would we not?" So we grabbed a bunch of water filters, we got on a plane, we headed down a couple days later, and we met people who legitimately had nothing. They had just lost their homes, they had lost everything in their life, they had lost their comfort, and we were able to meet them where they were at, talk to them, have conversations with them, give them a water filter, which seems so simple, but meant so much. And I specifically remember there was one time that we were walking through this community, and we heard this woman who was crying and sobbing, and she hadn't been able to move or walk for 2 months. And so her daughter was there, and she was explaining the situation to us, and we were like, all right, we're gonna pray for this woman, obviously. And so we put our hands on her, we start praying in Spanish, in English, we're praying. And as the time goes by, she starts to stop crying. And you could see as she became more full of life, and we saw God do a miracle. And when we were done praying for her, which was 10-15 minutes, I don't even know, she was able to get up and start walking. And her daughter was freaking out, because she's like, "What the heck? She has not been able to walk in 2 months. She's been crying out in pain." And just seeing God meet us where we were at, and literally show up in this little village in the middle of nowhere, in this little community that had just gotten hit by a huge flood, full of people who had literally nothing. And I think it's cool, because we say that, we feel the presence of God here, right? When we're in chapel, we're worshiping God, we feel God here. or we're driving in our car down the road and we're playing our worship music and we see God there. But it's one thing when you see that same God like show up in a place in this little tiny village out in the middle of nowhere in this little community in Costa Rica. And so that was a long-winded answer to the question, but yeah, for sure, some of my most impactful times.
Absolutely. And it's crazy how God shows up in those circumstances. So what would you say a global outreach is? How would you define it?
Ooh, I would say that global outreach is giving of yourself. It is not comfortable. It's not always glamorous. It's definitely not cute. Social media might make it seem that way occasionally, but it is serving. It's literally doing what Jesus is calling us to do. It's going out and meeting the least of these and loving your neighbor and loving others. Global outreach is extremely impactful, and it's something that I would definitely encourage you guys to do.
Yeah, so that's why it's like really important. What does it look like though usually? Is there a certain way that it has to be, or does it really depend on the trip you go on or where you go?
I think ultimately global outreach looks different wherever you go, whenever you go. You know, my other global outreach trips that I've been on are obviously going to look different than the global outreach trips that we do through Jessup. And every single trip looks different. We've had some conversations just with the global outreach team about how teams were supposed to go one place and then something happened and they ended up in a completely different country. And so global outreach it's not about the specific itinerary, the agenda, what happens on the day-to-day, although that is very nice for my organized brain. But global outreach is it's like serving. It's getting out of your comfort zone, and that looks different every single time. And I've known that to be true through the very many things that have gone wrong on many different global outreach trips that I've been on. But I would say ultimately, there is no itinerary and there is no agenda. The only agenda is to love God and love people. And when you have a solid team and you're doing it with people who also are loving God and loving people, that is what it's all about at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's awesome that's what's cool about it, and the goal is to go spread the gospel and serve others. But why is it important to do that? Why is it important for me to go on a global outreach trip?
I would say that global outreach is one of the most out of your comfort zone things you could do. And for those of you who maybe don't feel called to missions, or missions is not something that you're feeling super passionate about, or maybe you've never done it before, I would encourage you to say yes to what God is doing. Because when you do that, when you give of yourself, and when you set aside your own comfort and your own pride and your own agenda, God is going to do huge things through you. I've been able to go on trips with people ages 6 to literally 60. And I've seen little girls who are 6 years old who are super shy and super timid and not wanting to do anything, and then get into another country and get on stage and lead worship in a different language. God does big things when you say yes and when you trust that he knows what's best for you. When you sacrifice your own plans and your own comfort zone, God does really big things. And so not only will he push you out of your comfort zone, he will reveal to you who you are and reveal to you your strengths and the things that he's gifted you in. And it's not just about serving or saying that you're serving. You will learn a lot about who you are and where God has you and where he wants you by doing something like going on a trip like that.
So here's a more of a fun question. How is the church body, where we're the church, right? We're all people involved. How does that look different when you go to another country?
Okay, this is kind of a hard question because I believe that the church is a group of people gathered together who love Jesus. And so although in America, the church can look very glamorous and look very big and almost look like a concert sometimes or like a big show, I think that church is truly about people coming together and worshiping God and loving other people. And I think it's definitely different in other countries. It looks different. And you can see in other countries God moving in really big ways. And I think the reason for that is that in America, it's super easy for us to be distracted by the things of this world. And we have so much right in front of us. We have so many things that easily distract us from who God is and where God wants us. And in other countries, the only thing that they have to cling to is God. It truly is. And there have been people who have told me, they're like, I feel bad for you that you're from America. And I'm like, why? America's amazing. It's the land of opportunity. And they're like, you have so many things that distract you from God, and the only thing we have is God. And that is what matters most. And so I think church looks different. There have been times where I've been in churches in other countries, and it is quite the experience. And, I've seen church where there are literally 5 people gathered, and they're literally in the middle of a dirt field, and they are praying over each other, and God is literally there, and you can tell because people are passing out because God is literally there and the Spirit is in them. And so church looks different. It's going to look different in whatever country you go to, and one country is going to look different from a church in a different country. But at the end of the day, church looks the same because we're all gathering together to love God and worship Him. So.
I remember when I lived overseas, we went to South Africa, and the churches there they would sing worship until the pastor would show up, and they had no idea when he would show up. It'd be for hours and hours and hours. The first people would get there at 9 to set up, and the pastor might show up by 1, and then he'll start speaking, and then he'll speak for about 3 hours, and then they'll go all get dinner together. So that's a little bit of a different sort of church experience than I think we've experienced, where we, if you went to Bridgeway, it was an hour and a half service, and we were like, wow, that was long this week. They haven't finished worship yet.
Yeah, that's so true.
So what was your favorite church experience you've been to? Was there a time that you sang a song or did a dance that was your absolute favorite?
Okay, this last time I was in Costa Rica, I think in August, I believe, and it was the first time that I had seen they were doing all these dances throughout all the worship songs, and it was so fun. I'm like, okay, we're making worship like a party. This is a good time. I think that was one of my favorites. My other favorite would be being in Kenya and worship there. There is no designated worship leader in Kenya. Someone comes up, and that person might be 80 years old, and they lead everybody in worship. And when they worship, they worship. They are dancing, and they are having a great time, and it's super fun. And then, a 10-year-old girl will come up a few minutes later, and she will lead worship, and it will be fun, and it will be exciting, and everybody will worship, because there's not one designated worship leader. It's just a bunch of people worshiping God and having a good time and having so much fun doing it. But yeah, church in other countries is definitely super different. And for those of you that will get to experience that maybe this next summer, I think that in itself will transform your life, just because it's not always exactly what we picture it to look like. People worship very differently, and seeing that and watching that happen and being able to join in is so much fun.
So how do people get involved? So say I'm a Jessup student for some reason, and I want to go on a global outreach trip. How would I do that?
Well, you're asking the right person. We want you to get involved. We want you to go on global outreach. If you're feeling called to go to global outreach, we encourage you to say yes to that. We encourage you to do it. And maybe, kind of like I said earlier, maybe you're not called to missions, and that's not something that you feel super passionate about. I would encourage you to do it at least once and step out of your comfort zone, do something a little crazy, and step into a new culture, because I think God will move in really big ways when you say yes, even if it's not comfortable for you or not something that you're used to or not something that you love. And I understand that fear is a huge part of why people say no to global outreach. And I would encourage you to let God use you in big ways, because I think that when you take a step aside and out of the United States and you see the world for what it really is, and you see what life looks like outside of America, your life will be transformed just by seeing it. Like just by seeing it and by serving and by saying yes, God will do big things. So even for those of you who don't feel super called, I encourage you to try it out. And I know that sounds crazy and big and wild, but I do encourage you to try. And the Global Outreach team is super excited. We want you guys to join us. We want you to be a part of it, obviously. But if you guys want to get involved, you can go and talk to the people at our campus men table in the back on your way out. Or if you want to fill out the application for our Global Outreach trips next summer, they close next Monday. So you have one more week to get all of that stuff in. And you can find that by going to the WJU Campus Men Instagram. You can find it there, or you can go to myjessup.edu and find the application through that. But we would love to talk to you. We've got a few of the Campus Men team here that would love to talk to you more about what global outreach looks like. So if you have time on your way out tonight, we would love that.